This is a presentation of postcolonial criticism as introduced in Peter Barry's book, Beginning Theory. The chapter on postcolonial criticism begins with introducing the voices who were known in the 1980s and 1990s as postcolonial critics. These are Gayatri Spivak in her book In Other Worlds of 1987, Bill Ashcroft, The Empire Writes Back in 1989, Homi Bhabha, who we will read later, Nation and Narration of 1990, Edward Said, Culture and Imperialism in 1993, and we will come back to Edward Said later. All these books are major contributions to a discourse that questions the universal claim of earliest humanist critics with its focus on the West as the center of culture and science and art. But before these books, there were earlier voices often associated with the background of postcolonial theory, such as Frantz Fanon and Edward Said. At that time, the theory itself didn't gain in popularity, so let me sketch a brief note on the main ideas presented by these two voices that contributed to what we refer to today as postcolonial criticism. In 1961, Frantz Fanon published a book called The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon is a French psychiatrist from Martinique, which is an island in the Caribbean next to Puerto Rico. In his book, Fanon argues that colonized people must reject the colonialist ideology that devalues their culture, and they must find a voice of their own. Remember when we read about Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own, the main work within feminist theory? The similarities between the two theories don't stop here. There is more on that later. In 1978, Edward Said's Orientalism was published. Said is a Palestinian American who refers to a Eurocentric universalism that considers the West superior and the East inferior, and that the East is seen as the other, the place where Westerners hide those aspects that they do not wish to acknowledge themselves. Now, Orientalism, the term that Said used in his argument, the title of his book, is manifested in literature that adopts a Eurocentric perspective with Europe at the center of culture, or the center of the world, the center of science, morality, culture, and everything. This Eurocentric view sees the East, or the colonized, as the other. This idea of the other, or the East seen as the other, is probably best explained with a reminder of the study of the unconscious and how in the mirror stage we meet this other that is ourself, and in this other we hide or repress desires that we do not wish to acknowledge. So these desires become part of the unconscious as we gradually move from the imaginary into the symbolic. Again, if you remember Freud and Lacan and later studies of how we enter into language by moving into the symbolic order through hiding those desires, wishes that we do not wish to acknowledge. And this is all tied to the concept of the other. In the case of the Orientalists or Orientalist study, the East becomes this other, where Western desires and tendencies such as cruelty, sensuality, and laziness are hidden and projected. If you remember the word projection from psychoanalytic theory, projected onto the East. So characteristics that are Western are projected or painted on the East, or the other. This other, therefore, becomes exotic, since it is where our desires are projected, are hidden, it becomes exotic and desired. Now, in othering, whether it is the othering of a race or of a sex, the other is always seen as an anonymous mass rather than an individual, as a homogeneous people, similar in everything, with no distinctions among different people who belong to that other, to that culture, to that race. This homogeneous other is also seen as someone whose actions are the results of intuition and passion rather than science, reason, and logic, which are the reason for the action of the Western or the civilized. The awareness of how the non-European is seen as the other is one of the characteristics of post-colonial criticism. Our textbooks provide you with the example of Yeats and his Byzantium poems, where he paints a picture of Istanbul as this exotic other. Another characteristic of post-colonial criticism is its uneasy attitude to the colonial language. So again, if we look at Yeats as an example, we see him looking at the Irish language as a degraded form of English. Um, this has led some critics to argue that the colonizer's language, and Ireland was colonized by England, the colonizer's language is always tainted and not suitable for the colonized to use it. Again, if you remember in feminist theory, when we brought up Dale Spencer, a feminist who argues that language is a masculine tool used to subjugate women and used to perpetuate masculinity or the masculine discourse. This is similar. It's a similar argument made here with post-colonial critics who argued that the language of the colonized, be it English, French, Spanish, is forever tainted, and its use is problematic when it is used by the colonized. Sorry, the language of the colonizer is what's tainted, and when it's used by the colonized, it continues perpetrating Western ideologies. Also, using Yeats as an example, the book argues that Yeats exhibits features of a double identity of both the colonizer and the colonized. Yeats belongs to the upper class of the religion that is dominant in Ireland. This is why he is more in touch with the colonizer than he is the colonized, even though he is Irish, thus colonized. Now, this hybrid identity, mixed identity, is another one of those characteristics of post-colonial criticism. It looks at hybrid identities such as this one, or ones we see in Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart, for example. Achebe is an African writer educated in the West and writing in English. And as such, again, he is also accused or critiques for speaking for Africans when he doesn't really represent them because of his Western education. But the notion of this double identity or the fluid identity is also something we touched upon in feminist theory, especially when we looked at the feminist critics, French feminists, Sixou and Irigaray, who, with their idea that the identity of woman or the writing of woman is fluid, and that this fluidity makes their writing connected to post-structuralism and deconstruction, the same way that the fluidity of the post-colonial identity connects it to ideas of post-structuralism and deconstruction. Again, the fluid nature of language linked to the fluid nature of identity. Gayatri Spivak, mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, and Homi Bhabha, which you'll be reading for Wednesday, focused on the hybridity and the fluidity of identity in their work. Both Yeats and Achebe evoke images of a pre-colonial Ireland for Yeats and Africa for Achebe that is almost mythological, almost mystified. And this is typical of earlier types of post-colonial literature, but we'll get to these types in the next slide. For now, I'll move to the fourth characteristic of post-colonial criticism, which is the attention given to the cross-cultural interactions between East and West. Again, I will trace these interactions in the next slide. As was done when presenting feminist criticism, the book traces phases that post-colonial literature went through. The first phase is referred to here as the adopt phase, where post-colonial writers imitate the language and structure and genre of the colonial power because it is the one with power. Just like in the feminine phase, women writers imitated male writers. The second stage is called adapt, and this is where the European language and form is adapted to the colonized subject. So the subject matter is African, the story, the plot line is African, but the structure, the type of writing, the genre, the behaviors even of the characters are Western or European. The third phase is what Barry calls adept, And it is a phase that sees the colonial writer as independent, an independent adult, um, not like an apprentice to the Western writer who copies him or her to be like them, nor is it a licensee who takes some elements of West and some elements of African, but actually an independent writer with their own style, whether in terms of plot or structure or genre. As postcolonial literature went through its stages, or was demonstrated to us through different stages, adopt, adapt, adapt, introduced earlier, so did postcolonial criticism change its focus through the years. In its first stages, postcolonial criticism paid attention to how the East represents the West. How the West represents the East, and argued that these representations are biased. Critique has been launched on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness for its depiction of the African man, for example, on A.M. Forster's A Passage to India for its representation of the Indian, Albert Camus's The Outsider for its representation of misrepresentation of Algeria. This stage is similar to the early stage of feminist criticism of the 1970s. The second stage moves to looking at how the colonized represent themselves, and attention here is given to exploring that diversity in the culture of the colonized and the hybridity of identity mentioned earlier. There's also another way of distinguishing types of postcolonial criticism that is similar to what we saw with feminist critics, where some postcolonial critics focus on studying how the colonized is represented, such as done by Edward Said, while others investigate theoretical configurations that derive from post-structuralist theory, such as seen in the works of Homi Bhabha. Now, what would post-colonial critics do? They reject claims of the universalism of Western culture and literature. They show how Western literature is silent about colonialism and imperialism. They celebrate the hybridity, the mixed culture of the colonial subject. They examine representations of other cultures in literature. They look at cultural difference and diversity, and they view marginality and otherness as sources of potential change, so they give them a positive view. Now, for an application, the book uses Jane Austen's Mansfield Park and presents a reading that Edward Said himself came upon. What Said did is bring the background of the novel as a foreground. So he looked at the estate owned by Sir Burton that is located in Antigua, not in England. This state is what controls, at least financially, Mansfield Park. Said argues that this state must for sure have used the slave trade if the plantation owner is to make any profit. And that in itself puts the question of morality, which is the main focus of the novel, puts that into a questionable element. In this, Said is showing that which was the background of the novel, the hidden part of the novel, the part that was stowed away or put in the unconscious, so to speak, is actually essential to the meaning of the novel and essential to reading the novel. And that that absent plantation owner that is living in a colonized country is actually the center of the novel. So with this, Said is not only exposing England as a colonizer in the 19th century in the midst of its claim for morality, but also indicates that which is hidden or the other is vital to the meaning of the self, or in this case, the East is vital to the meaning of the West. Thank you.